Welcome to Dispatches, a production of the VVA Veteran Magazine and Vietnam Veterans of America, hosted by arts editor Marc Leepson. Let's begin.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 49 of Dispatches, a production of the VVA Veteran Magazine, coming to you live and on tape, as always, from Vietnam Veterans of America's national headquarters, right here in downtown Silver Spring, Maryland. Our special guest today is Matthew Delmont, who is Associate Dean of International and Interdisciplinary Studies and a Professor of History at Dartmouth University. We'll be talking about his new book, Until the Last Gun is Silent, a story of patriotism, the Vietnam War, and the fight to save America's soul. It's an engagingly written book that tells two main Vietnam War stories: Coretta Scott King's largely underappreciated role in the anti-war movement, and the war and post-war experiences of Medal of Honor recipient Dwight "Skip" Johnson from Detroit. My review of this excellent book will appear in the upcoming July-August 2026 issue of the magazine. The book briefly focuses on Coretta Scott King's long and tireless work for peace, as well as Skip Johnson's life before, during, and after he was drafted into the Army. But Professor Delmont broadens out his narrative also by telling the stories of, as he puts it, African-American everyday soldiers, veterans, and activists whose lives were shaped by the Vietnam War. A former Guggenheim Fellow and an expert on African-American history and the history of civil rights, Matt Delmont's other books include Half American, the heroic story of African-Americans fighting in World War II and abroad, which came out in 2022. He comes to us today from somewhere in the wilds of New Hampshire. It's great to meet you, Matt. Congratulations on the book and welcome to Dispatches.
Thank you so much, Marc. I appreciate the invitation to join in conversation today.
Let's get started. And before we get into the book and your work, I'd like you to tell us in brief how you got interested in the Vietnam War as your next subject for a book. And I'm guessing it had something to do with what you called your first lesson about the war when you were growing up. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, so all my work focuses on American history, and more particularly African-American history and the history of civil rights. My last book, which you mentioned, was called Half American, focused on Black Americans in World War II. And as I was giving presentations on that book, I kept getting questions about, how does the story change when you move to the Vietnam era? And so I knew I wanted to focus on something related to the Vietnam War era, but I wasn't sure exactly where to start. I was back in Minneapolis, where I grew up, visiting my father shortly before he passed away, and we were trying to kind of make up for lost time. We were talking about his memories of the era. He didn't serve himself, but I was asking about, he graduated from high school in 1966, and so I wanted to sort of learn about his own memories of the era. And it was interesting talking to him. He actually told me a story he'd never told me before, that he was a track star in high school, and he got recruited to run at the Air Force Academy. But something ended up coming up in the physical, and so then that fell through. But then as a consequence, he never got drafted. And said the way he put it was, the military didn't come looking for him, and he sure as heck didn't go looking for the military. But as I sort of talked with him, he knew I was working on this book about the Vietnam War era, and he told me a story about a soldier that he remembered. He couldn't remember the name, but he said, there was another Black soldier earned the Medal of Honor. He's from Detroit or from Chicago. Chicago, where my dad grew up. And the way he described it, he said, he won the Medal of Honor, but they got him when he came home. It was just kind of a brief reference. It was clearly something that had been important for my dad, because it's someone who's almost the exact same generation. But I went home and did a bit of researching and realized the person he was talking about was a man named Dwight "Skip" Johnson, who was from Detroit, earned the Medal of Honor, and then had a very challenging time when he came back to the United States. And I realized once I heard that story from my dad that was a perfect person on which to focus to tell this larger story about the Vietnam War. But then as I kind of reflected on it, it made me realize some of my earliest memories related to Vietnam were when people who were my dad's close friends would come over, and I was told as a 10, 11-year-old, you can't play these certain video games, or you can't make loud sounds, don't talk about these things. And as a 10-year-old, I didn't really know what that was about, but it turns out that Tony was a Vietnam vet, and my parents were trying to sort of help me make sure we were mindful of his experiences when he came over to the house. And so I really do credit my late father with introducing me to the story of Dwight "Skip" Johnson that became one of the key stories for this new book.
Yeah, that You say that about when you were that age and being made aware of Vietnam veterans. You wouldn't have put it that way, but adjustments or problems with adjust. I just have to tell you real quick. So when I came back, I came back with a friend. I live on the East Coast who lived in Seattle in the suburbs, and we spent the first night at his house, and I slept in his little brother's room. He was about your age at that time, I think, 8 or 10.
Yeah.
And they told me that, of course, we got in the middle of the night, and I slept till 2 o'clock the next morning. And they told me that the kid um, had to get something from his room. So he knew there was a Vietnam vet sleeping in there. He did the low crawl. He did the low crawl up to his dresser, reached up, got his watch or whatever it was, and went out. But man, that's almost a universal thing. I mean,
Yeah.
I had to tell that one because it really resonated with me,
Yeah.
and it says an awful lot, doesn't it? I mean, the kid knew, I mean, the kid knew.
Yeah.
So anyway, so you had Skip Johnson. So how did you decide to use Coretta Scott King as a main character?
Well, Coretta story is really interesting for me because it's something I've taught about in the classroom. Obviously, when you teach African American history, Martin Luther King Jr. takes on such an important role, such an iconic figure. And so we talk about him. And I knew that she was an activist in her own right, but I largely focused on her activism later in the 60s or into the 70s. But as I dug more into it and started doing some research, I realized she was at or leading almost every major anti-Vietnam War protest from the early to mid 60s all the way into the early 1970s. And so as I started to gather the information, I realized, she could be a key figure to try to give her, shine the light on her, to make her the kind of focal point of the anti-war story in the book. And so in putting together the book, I used those twin stories to be able to talk about the Black experience more broadly, and I think really the American experience more broadly. Skip Johnson, I think, was really illustrative of working class, drafted, experienced combat, and really his whole life was shaped by the impact of that combat when he came back to the United States. And then for Coretta Scott King, I think one of her great attributes was she was willing to ally with people across all different demographics and willing to speak with all different groups to try to get them to understand the costs of the Vietnam War, and really was unafraid to challenge politicians, senators to reckon with what this war was costing Americans, not just in terms of economic costs, but in terms of the lives of so many young men and women who were involved.
Yeah, I remember all this stuff, right? I mean, the anti-war movement, which was sort of fuzzy in the mid 60s and didn't really spread as much as they did by 68, 69.
Mhm.
And I was surprised at actually how much Coretta Scott King did too. I mean, you just mentioned that you learned, is that what you learned that, and how did that shape your narrative more, or tell me about that?
It did. Yeah, I mean, going into the book, almost everything I knew about her activism was after Martin was assassinated. And so I tried to learn as much as I could about her early life. For her, activism starts as a college student at Antioch College in Ohio. She already is part of the NAACP chapter there. She attends the Progressive Party political convention in 1946. She hears Paul Robeson speak and sing, the famous athlete and actor and activist. And he becomes a kind of iconic figure for her. She tries to model her own. She was a singer in her own right, so she models her own performance and political activism around Paul Robeson. And she's already kind of very forward-looking, very committed activist by the time she meets Martin Luther King in the early 1950s in Boston. So I think one of the things that attracts them to each other is that they both have these strong activist commitments. But one of the breakthroughs for me was just figuring out where to look for Coretta Scott King, because now historians use these really massive newspaper databases that a lot of newspapers have been digitized. But when you search for Coretta Scott King, you get a certain number of results. When you search for Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr., you get 4 times the number of results, because that's just how she was referred to using the common phrasing of the era. So even if she was the main invited speaker, she was still Mrs. Martin Luther King Jr. And so that really kind of opened up the research possibilities for me, because then I could start to kind of map out, she's at Madison Square Garden in 1965. She's talking at Black colleges in 66. She's talking at a beautician's convention in 68, that she's really crisscrossing the country, in some cases even going globally, talking consistently about the need to connect the anti-Vietnam war struggle with the civil rights struggle, the need to address poverty in the United States, the need to work for peace and justice at a national and a global scale. And so I came away really amazed and inspired by how vocal she was, how courageous she was, and really how much she influenced her husband. I think one of the things I try to emphasize is that I think to Martin's credit, he acknowledged that she was a big influence on his own eventual stance against the war.
Yeah, that surprised me, and in a good way. And also, could you talk a little bit about the pushback that she got and Martin Luther King did get when he finally came out against the war? And it wasn't, some of it was even from civil rights leaders. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's most interesting about understanding the story as it unfolds. And I will say, I mean, as a teacher, a lot of my students don't know a lot about the Vietnam era these days. I mean, these are young people. We are welcoming the class of 2030 at Dartmouth this coming fall, right? So these young people for whom the Vietnam era is a long time ago now. And so I think when they come to the story, they already know about the protests that have emerged by the late 60s and early 70s. And so getting them to understand in 64, 65, 66, 67, it was really atypical for Americans to be willing to speak out against the war. And there was a lot of controversy around it, even among civil rights activists. And so for both Martin and Coretta, when they're giving these speeches in 65, 66, they're being criticized by people who they consider to be allies. And that's one of the big challenges for Martin is that he's trying to weigh, how much is this going to cost me with trying to get civil rights legislation passed? Because he knows Lyndon B. Johnson has very thin skin and is going to cut him off if he goes on the wrong side of him in terms of the war. And a lot of people are familiar now with King's Riverside Church speech in 67, where he finally breaks his silence in the Vietnam War. When King, a couple of years earlier, starts to dip his toes in the water, speaking out against the war, Senator Dodd, Democrat from Connecticut, goes to all the major newspapers and really censures him. He says, what does this guy know? What is he doing going out of his lane? This is foreign policy. He doesn't have anything to do with that. And at that point, King does kind of take a big step back and says, I can't do both things at the same time. I can't do the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement. I'm just going to focus on civil rights. When eventually Martin does give the Riverside Church speech, almost everyone condemns him. All the white media is opposed to him, but even mainstream civil rights activists, Roy Wilkins, the leaders of the Urban League, even his own father is kind of looking at him saying, Martin, what have you done? Coretta stands by his side and is relieved that he finally is able to say publicly what she knows that he believes. But I think part of the real courage that they both demonstrated was being willing to take on what at the time was a really unpopular decision. But I think history has shown that they were right to call attention to what are the costs of these foreign policy decisions that both political parties, both from Kennedy and then Johnson and then eventually Nixon, that they're leading the country into an increasingly unpopular war. Coretta and Martin were both early to the anti-war movement in terms of being willing to speak publicly on that.
Yeah, again, I remember that. I remember I graduated from college in 67, and I remember how controversial it was. Sort of like, he was almost universally condemned when he made that speech. I mean, like, what is he doing, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I think the phrase "the '60s" kind of is misinterpreted especially by younger people. I mean, why not? They would think the '60s, quote unquote, started in 1960 and then in 1969. But as I remember, and was the case, the early '60s were more like the '50s, right? And then it wasn't until I don't know, when did the quote unquote '60s start? 65, 66, and it went into the '70s, right? It went into the mid '70s. So I've always been, I taught a class in U.S. history at community college, and I always made sure that I did 2 classes on the Vietnam War in the '60s. And I love to point that out to students. So and I just wanted to say, so I wanted to bring this quote, we were just talking about it. You said that Dr. King's decision to publicly work against the war would not have been reached without Coretta's influence. That's pretty bold statement. I mean, and it happened that way, correct?
Yeah, it's true. I think, I mean, I try to chart it from when they first meet and fall in love in the early 50s through his assassination in 1968. But I think some of the key points, when he receives the Nobel Prize in 1964, obviously he's blown away to receive this recognition. But for Coretta, she describes it as a real challenge to both of them to look beyond just the civil rights struggle, just beyond the sort of national movement, to understand that this is a real challenge to them to work for human rights internationally and to work for peace and justice internationally. And so that was an important point where it pressured him to think even broader and more globally in scale. In 65, I mentioned earlier, she is at the podium at Madison Square Garden for one of the earliest rallies to try to call attention to and end the early stages of the Vietnam War. She's, in that case, kind of representing both of them at this stage, because I think the invitation initially goes to him. He's not able to do it, not willing to take that public stance, but she's there on the podium as Miss Martin Luther King Jr. A couple years earlier, she'd gone to Geneva with a group of women called Women Strike for Peace to try to raise attention. And so their conversations over the dinner table, all of her speaking events where she's linking the civil rights movement to the anti-war movement, those are all things that he's obviously is aware of. And then to his credit, he's asked directly by a TV interviewer in 1965 who notices that Coretta's giving all these speeches, and the TV interviewer has made the assumption that Martin has influenced Coretta, and he says, how did you influence your wife in activism in this way? And Martin, to his credit, says, it's actually the opposite. I'd like to be able to satisfy my masculine ego to say that I had that influence, but it's actually the opposite. She's influenced me on these issues.
Yeah.
And then when you look at the actual kind of a lot of the language he's using, I mean, obviously King, like many other public figures, had different speechwriters who were involved with many of his speeches. But a lot of the language he uses about linking peace and justice, about how you can't separate the anti-war movement from the civil rights movement, are very similar things to what Coretta is saying in 65, 66. Martin doesn't say them publicly until 67, 68. And so it is the case where I think they worked together, they pushed each other, but she really did influence him to take a stronger, bolder stance against the war.
Yeah, I think that's great that you brought it out so well in there. Let's talk about Skip Johnson because, I mean, I've been reading and reading about the Vietnam War for over 40 years, probably getting on 45 now, and I have a lot of accounts of Medal of Honor recipients' actions. But I will tell you that reading your description and reading his official citation, what he did that day, it was on January 15th, 1968, he was a tanker, was, I mean, as extraordinary as any, and there are some amazing stories. You know that, I'm sure. So could you tell me a little bit about that? I know, and the thing that's stuck in my head was that one of his buddies said that that day he performed like a one-man army. So you've researched him. Can you tell me what, I mean, just briefly tell people who don't know what happened and what do you think, I don't want to use the word triggered, but what was behind him just going nuts and risking his life and acting so heroically? Yes.
Yeah, so Dwight Skip Johnson was a young man who grew up in Detroit, grew up in the housing projects, the Jeffries projects in Detroit. So like many draftees, he was a working class guy from the Midwest. He graduated from high school in 1966, drafted shortly thereafter, sent to basic training in Fort Knox. He gets assigned to the 69th Armor and arrives in Vietnam in early 1967. He's there for nearly a year. His unit doesn't see a lot of combat. They have to navigate around some ambushes. They largely do a lot of mine sweeping duty, and their job is to keep roads open for truck convoys that are moving through the Central Highlands in Vietnam.
Yeah, which is not exactly a safe job in that war. Right. It's
Yeah,
not combat, but sorry.
yeah. So near the end of his one-year tour in January of 1968, his tank unit is caught in an ambush in Dak To. And I think the thing, reading the accounts that he gave, and then I was able to speak to about a dozen men who served in the 69th alongside him, both to understand what it meant to serve in a tank crew in Vietnam and the kind of particulars of what role each of the four men would take on, but also people who were actually there for that particular ambush. The consensus story is that it was seeing men that he had served with for a year having just been killed. It was that, and then just the need to survive triggered for him this impulse to draw on his training, draw on tremendous reserves of bravery, and to fight his way out of this ambush. So the way I describe it in the book is he's kind of literally leaping from tank to tank, grabbing any weapon he can at his disposal to fight off the ambushers. At one point, one of the Vietnamese soldiers has Skip directly in front of him with a rifle. Skip is sure that that's going to be the end of his life, but the gun misfires. And so he's able to survive that, he's able to dispatch that enemy soldier. Eventually, other American troops arrive, subdue the ambush, and Skip is one of the few people from the unit to survive. It was a life-altering event for him. It was something that obviously he never would have wished on anyone, but to a person, everyone who either witnessed it or read about it, or heard his story afterwards, described just a tremendous, tremendous story of bravery, kind of tapping into a warrior ethos that sounds like a movie, but he actually did it.
Yeah, a tanker. He was a tanker.
Yeah.
His tank threw a tread, was caught in an ambush. He had to get out of there. He just charges the enemy, right, with a borrowed 45 or something like that, and
Yeah.
runs out of ammunition, goes back, gets another weapon, runs out of, I mean, it's just an amazing story. And you know, unfortunately, we have to talk a little bit about what happened to Skip after he came home. It's sad, and it's not surprising, I guess you could say. And could you go into that a little bit? I mean, not into too much detail, but give people an idea about, what getting the Medal of Honor meant to him, and pluses and minuses, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think like many veterans from that era, his transition back to the United States was rapid. He is given morphine to calm down from the ambush. A couple days later, he's back in the United States at a military hospital. 2 weeks after that, he's back in Detroit. And so there was very little, this is 68, there's very little thinking given to how to help and support his readjustment.
Well, like very little, as in none.
As in none. Yeah. As in an embarrassingly limited amount, none. He thankfully connects with a young woman named Katrina, who he had a couple dates with before he went to Vietnam, and they fell in love by writing letters while he was deployed. I mean, I should say that one of my key sources for the book was Katrina. She's a fabulous, feisty woman. She's now in her mid-70s, lives in suburban Detroit. And so I was able to interview her to get a better sense of Skip's full life story. Because if you were to Google him, you'll find stories about the Medal of Honor and then stories about his tragic death later when he gets back to Detroit. But she really helped to personalize Skip's story for me and give me some more of the kind of human element of his life. He reconnects with Katrina when he gets back. They fall in love, get married. But really for those 6 months after he's back in Detroit, before he gets notified about the Medal of Honor, he's just trying to get his life going again. He's 21 at that point. And for a 21-year-old working class black man in Detroit in 1968, there's not a lot of opportunities. He hopes to be able to go to college. He wants to become a computer programmer, but there's not a lot of opportunities there. Kind of out of the blue, he gets contacted by the White House, who let him know that he's been awarded the Medal of Honor. A couple of military policemen come to his door first and kind of make sure that he hasn't been up to any mischief in the last 6 months. But once he clears that check, then he gets this call saying, "You've been awarded the Medal of Honor. Please come to the White House." 3 weeks later, he's dumbstruck because it's not anything he ever would have imagined. He goes to the White House, receives. You can find online the video of him receiving the Medal of Honor from President Johnson, one of President Johnson's last Medal of Honor ceremonies. And from that point forward, he becomes a celebrity in Detroit because this is after the Detroit riots of 1968. It's after King's assassination. So there's a lot invested in seeing this young black war hero. So there are dinners in his honor. General Westmoreland comes back, celebrates him. The governor of Michigan is there, the mayor of Detroit. Everyone wants a piece of this young black war veteran. The Army offers him, well, because Skip can't find a really excellent job, the Army offers him the ability to become a recruiter. So now he becomes an Army recruiter and is going into Black high schools, the same ones he attended, to recruit other young Black men to join the war effort. He's kind of ambivalent about that. He's thankful for the money, thankful for the opportunity, but by 69, the time he's in these Black high schools, the war has taken on a different complexion, particularly among a lot of African Americans, where they are not eager for the kind of sales pitch that he's giving. At the same time, he still isn't getting any real treatment for the psychological wounds he experienced from being involved in this ambush. And the way Katrina describes it is the loving, caring, sweet, gentle man that she fell in love with after about a year just isn't there anymore. And he has a downward spiral that results in his tragic death in a attempted armed robbery in a convenience store in Detroit in 1971. But part of my goal in focusing on him in the book was to tell it sort of an honest story about someone who obviously didn't aspire to be a war hero, but gave everything he could to help save lives of men in his unit, gave everything he could to help defend the country, but then came home and I think like too many veterans from the era just wasn't cared for in the way that the country needed to care for that generation of veterans.
Yeah, it's a shameful chapter in our history about the way we were treated when we came back. But you tell the story very well. And like I said, you broaden it out too. Most of it's about Coretta Scott King and Skip Johnson, but there's a lot of other stories about veterans and their readjustment and their getting drafted and so on. So I really love the book, and I thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today. And again, the book is, and I just want to say, The Last Guns Go Silent. That's from a speech that Coretta Scott King gave. Yeah, I looked up the speech, just to after I read about it, and it was very moving, and it was it was very moving. Let's put it that way. So, well, Matt, thank you very much.
All right.
Congratulations on the book, and good luck.
I appreciate it. It was great talking with you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye.
Bye. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks to the Dispatches team here at Vietnam Veterans of America's National Headquarters. Quentin Butcher, Alfie Williams, the indispensable Daniel Devora, Sean Venables, and myself. Dispatches was created by Michael Keating. And stay tuned soon for the next episode of Dispatches, a production of the VVA Veteran magazine.
My dear friends of peace and freedom, I come to New York today with a strong feeling that my dearly beloved husband, who was snatched suddenly from our midst, slightly more than 3 weeks ago now, would have wanted me to be present today. You who will not be deluded by the talk of peace, but who press on in the knowledge that the work of peacemaking must continue until the last gun is silent. I come to you in my grief only because you keep alive the work and dreams for which my husband gave his life. We must now turn our attention and the sole force of the movement to the problems of the poor here at home. My husband always saw the problem of racism and poverty here at home and militarism abroad as two sides of the same coin. In fact, it's very clear that our policy at home is to try to solve social problems through military means, just as we have done abroad. The interrelatedness of domestic and foreign affairs is no longer questioned. The bombs we drop on the people of Vietnam continue to explode at home with all their devastating potential. There is no reason why a nation as rich as ours should be blighted with poverty, disease, and illiteracy. It's plain that we don't care about poor people except to exploit them as cheap labor and victimize them through excessive rents and consumer prices. Our Congress passes laws which subsidize corporation farms, oil companies, airlines, and houses for suburbia. But when they turn their attention to the poor, they suddenly become concerned about balancing the budget and cut back on funds for Head Start, Medicare, and mental health appropriations. I'd now like to address myself to the women. The woman power of this nation can be the power which makes us whole and heals the broken community now so shattered by war and poverty and racism. This challenge is simply but profoundly stated in the words of one of our greatest poets, the late Langston Hughes. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It had tacks in it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor. Bare, but all the time I's been a-climbing on, and reaching landings, and turning corners, and sometimes going in the dark where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn your back. Don't you step down on these stairs because you find it kind of hard. Don't you stop now. For I's still going, honey. And life for me ain't been no crystal stair. With this determination, with this faith, we will be able to create new homes, new communities, new cities, a new nation, yea, a new world, which we desperately need. Thank you.